Well, good morning, everyone. So good to be here. If you're visiting with us, especially grateful to have you with us as well. Hope that you will stick around, give us a chance to get to know you better. This morning, we are going to be talking about finding rest in 2024. And we're going to launch from Mark chapter 2, if you'll open your Bibles there, please, to Mark chapter 2. It is here that the Pharisees accused Jesus' disciples of violating the Sabbath day, which is pretty absurd since Jesus invented the Sabbath day. He is the Lord of the Sabbath day, and if his disciples were sinning against God, Jesus would not have allowed that to happen. So this is, of course, a false accusation because they're plucking heads of grain as they pass through the fields. Here's Jesus' response. Well, he has a longer response. We'll just pick up on the tail end here. Verses 27 and 28, Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath." One of the 10 Commandments was to honor the Sabbath day one time per week and set it apart as a day of rest in which no work should be done. Well, the Pharisees, they kind of asked themselves the question, well, what exactly constitutes work? How exactly do we define work so that we don't violate the Sabbath? And what they did was they came up with 100 man-made rules defining what work is and what work is not. Here's the giant list of all the things that you can't do on the Sabbath, otherwise you'll violate it and anger the Lord. And what they did was, ironically, turn it into one of the least restful days of the week, and probably the most stressful day of the week because they were worried about all these, regulations. And Jesus rebukes them, and he says, essentially, it was never God's intention for human beings to be slaves to a bunch of endless regulations on the Sabbath day. It was God's intention for the Sabbath rest to be a blessing and a gift in people's lives. The Sabbath was made for man, for our benefit. It's 2024 now, and a new year is meant to be a time of new hope and new possibilities and fresh starts. But sometimes I'm afraid the new year really just means it's time to pile more stuff on the calendar. It's time to crank things up. And all those activities we did in 2023, hey, we got to do 3 times as much this year and really get those activities going. It might be tempting to adopt the slogan, do more in 2024, because you can't resist a good rhyme. But I want to flip that on its head this morning and say, let's find more rest in 2024. I know that doesn't rhyme. But let's find more rest in 2024. And by that, I don't mean let's lay around on the couch and just do nothing. I'm talking about the kind of soul rest that we learn from the Sabbath day. Now, I understand. The New Testament does not require Christians to keep the Sabbath. This is not a command of God. It's not a requirement of God. Paul says this in Colossians 2:16 and 17. Therefore, no one is to act as your judge in regard to food or drink or in respect to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath day, things which are a mere shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Paul's saying, let no one judge you as sinful for not keeping Sabbath days, because those were just Old Testament shadows pointing to Jesus, who came to give us the true rest. If you think about it, the Sabbath day was a 1-day-a-week reprieve of the toilsome labor caused by the curse of sin. So it was a 1-day-a-week rest from the curse of sin, and it was designed so that you could take pleasure and delight in the presence of God, the way Adam and Eve did back in the Garden of Eden, before sin ruined it all. Yet Jesus came to give us permanent reprieve from the curse of sin, to make every day a day to delight in God's Eden-like presence. And so Jesus says in Matthew 11:28-29, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." True Sabbath soul rest is impossible without Jesus. Without Him, we'll be trying to rest by taking vacations and watching TV and sleeping. And there's no doubt that those things provide some form of rest for our minds and our bodies, but it won't give us the deep soul rest that the Sabbath day was trying to teach the Israelites about. So while I am not binding the Sabbath day on anyone this morning, I do want us to learn from some principles about the Sabbath day that God intended to be a blessing and a gift to His people by helping us find rest for our minds and our bodies, yes, but also our souls. And at the end, I'll give you some practical steps to put all this in action. The first principle this morning that we learn from the Sabbath is that soul rest cultivates trust. Turn with me, please, to Exodus chapter 16. Exodus chapter 16. This is when God first introduces the concept of Sabbath rest to the Israelites. And He's brought them out of Egypt, and now they're in the wilderness. There's no food, and so God says, I'll provide you manna from heaven. But there's a stipulation. You are only allowed to go out and collect food for 6 days of the week. But on the seventh day, you are not allowed to go out and collect food. And God promises them, don't worry about it, because I will provide you double food on the sixth day, so that on the seventh you'll have enough. And you won't actually need to go out and work on the seventh, because I will take care of you. Well, let's look how this goes. In Exodus 16, verses 27 to 29, it came about on the seventh day that some of the people went out to gather, but they found none. And then the Lord said to Moses, how long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my instructions? See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath, therefore He gives you bread for 2 days. On the sixth day, remain every man in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the seventh day. So they went out and worked on the Sabbath anyway. Now, why did they do that? Because they didn't trust that God would take care of them. They thought they wouldn't have enough if they didn't go out and work. And Moses says, actually, instead, what you need to do is trust in God to give to you and to provide for you instead. Sometimes we overwork today for the same reason. We are driven by worry and anxiety that if we don't take that extra shift, we're not going to have the money to survive. If we don't work harder than everyone else in school, we won't get into a good college, and we won't get that internship, and we won't succeed in life. If we don't take that promotion that requires us to work on weekends, then our salary, it's not going to keep up with inflation. And then Jesus comes along in Matthew 6, and He says, slow down, everybody. Everybody just calm down. Stop worrying. Stop being filled with anxiety, chasing safety and security in this world. He says, you see the flowers out there? They're not doing any work at all. And God is taking care of them. How much more valuable are you? And how much more will God take care of you? Soul rest says to God, I trust you, and I'll be fine. Secondly, soul rest cultivates freedom. There's two versions of the Ten Commandments. There's the Exodus version, and then there's the Deuteronomy version. We'll start with the Deuteronomy version. In Deuteronomy 5:15, He says to the Israelites, you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. And the Lord your God brought you out of there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. So notice the rationale for keeping the Sabbath day is to remember that they aren't slaves anymore. In Egypt, under Pharaoh's tyranny, they had no rest. They were working 7 days a week, right, all day long. But now that God has freed them from Egypt, they can actually take a day and they can actually rest because they're not slaves. But the irony is sometimes we overwork today because we become slaves to new pharaohs. We become slaves to over-demanding work schedules, slaves to cultural expectations that say that you have to move up the corporate ladder if you want to have worth and value, slaves to family expectations that say that the house has to be spotless at all times, to man-made religious traditions that place us under a works-based system that tells you need to continue working harder and harder and doing more and more if you want to be good enough to go to heaven. Slaves to our technological devices where we can't go 10 minutes without looking at our phones or checking emails. Slaves to routines that we may have started for ourselves with good intentions but have become so unwieldy they have become burdens in our lives. Setting aside a deliberate period of soul rest from all of the pharaohs of our schedules and tasks and duties and expectations will remind us that God has set us free from it all. Soul rest says, I am free. I'm not a slave anymore. Thirdly, soul rest cultivates delight. Now, here's the other version of the Ten Commandments, and there's a different rationale behind this one. Exodus 20, verse 11. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I had that on the screen. You should actually still be open to Exodus. Exodus 20 in verse 11. He says, For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So when God rested on the seventh day of creation, it wasn't because he was tired. It was because he was enjoying the fruit of his labor. After every single day of creation, God would look out, and it says that he saw that it was good. But what's interesting is that only happens on the first 5 days. On the sixth day, he doesn't look out and see that it was good. It says this in Genesis 1:31, God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. When God looked at all that he had accomplished, a summation of all of the 6 days, it's not just good, it's very good. Exodus 31:17 says that the Sabbath is a sign between me and the sons of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, but on the seventh day he ceased from labor and was refreshed. On the Sabbath, God wanted the Israelites to delight in and be refreshed by his work in creation. And sometimes we get so busy and focused on our own creation and our own work that we don't even notice God's work in creation anymore. We drive past this beautiful scenery, right? Because we're making business deals on the phone. We stay inside and we trade sunshine for artificial light. We may go for walks, but we do so listening to the news or listening to something for work, and we can't even hear the birds chirping or the leaves rustling in the wind. And it's hard to delight in what we don't slow down long enough to experience. Soul rest says, I see you, God, and I am amazed. Now, I believe God's also teaching us here to delight in the work that we accomplish in our lives through him. Whether that's out in the workforce or whether it's at home, taking care of the house or raising kids, God designed us to delight in and be refreshed by our work. In fact, this is one of the things that Solomon concedes about this life in Ecclesiastes 2:24, that there's nothing better for a man than to eat and to drink and to tell himself that his labor is good. This also I've seen, that it is from the hand of God. As toilsome as our work is because of the curse of sin in the world, work itself is not a curse. Work itself is a gift from God, and we can delight in its fruit. We can say, my labor is good, like God said that about his own labor in Genesis. We can be grateful for the work that we've accomplished by his strength. We can say, God used me to help someone this week. God gave me the good health to support my family. God gave me a talent that I was able to use to help my company, which helps my community. If all we ever do is work and we never rest, work becomes a terrible burden and a meaningless grind. Soul rest helps us step back and to see the good in it. Number 4, soul rest cultivates identity. In Exodus 31:13, God says, as for you, speak to the sons of Israel, saying, you shall surely observe my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. The Sabbath days were meant to remind his people that their identity was wrapped up in him. He was the one who sanctified them. He was the one who set them apart as his own special people. He called them earlier in Exodus 19, my own special treasure. Sometimes we overwork because our identity and self-worth are too wrapped up in what we do. Our culture says you are what you do. Your value comes from the kind of career you have, how much money you make, how much you're producing in the world, and how busy you are. And it becomes this never-ending chase that makes our work even more exhausting because we're trying to use our work to fill a void in our souls that it could never fill. Jesus says from the cross, when he had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished." And he bowed his head and he gave up his spirit. This is why Jesus is the fulfillment of the soul rest the Sabbath was pointing toward. Because in Jesus, all the work has been done that gives us our value and our self-worth and our purpose and our meaning and our identity. We don't have to work endless hours to prove that we're good enough. We don't have to rely on our work to validate our existence because Jesus' work on the cross does that, and now we can rest in His grace. We can rest in His work. And soul rest says, "I am yours, God. I belong. And my value comes from what you did for me on the cross." Number 5, soul rest cultivates contentment. In Amos chapter 8, verses 4 and 5, he's condemning the Israelites. And he says, "Hear this, you who trample the needy to do away with the humble of the land, saying, when will the new moon be over, that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath, that we may open the wheat market, to make the bushel smaller and the shekel bigger, and to cheat with dishonest scales." To the Israelites, he's rebuking every day was a chance to make money. And even worse, it was a day to cheat people and make even more money for themselves. And so the Sabbath day just got in the way. So we can't rest. We got to be out here working. We got to be out here lining our pockets. We can't wait for the Sabbath day to be over. And sometimes we overwork because we just want more money and more stuff. I am amazed that since 1946, Chick-fil-A has been closed on Sunday. And I'll just say, since 1946, I have wanted a chicken sandwich on Sundays for all of these years. Okay, but they've managed to stay closed this long despite all the societal pressure. It was around up until about 1960, everybody was closed on Sunday. Right, but then that started changing, and now Chick-fil-A is one of the few. There's others, Crumble Cookie and Four Rivers and all the other stuff that I really want on Sundays. But it's amazing because when you do the math, Forbes kind of looked into this. They're losing $1.2 billion a year by being closed on Sundays. And it is a pretty bold statement by the owners to say, yeah, we're okay with that. I will give up $1.2 billion a year because I'm content. We have enough. This is what soul rest says to God. We're saying, I'm okay with losing out. I have enough, Lord. I was just talking to a friend of mine on the phone in New York, and he told me he's been turning down promotions at work. He's really good at what he does, gets offered promotions a lot, and he turns them down every time, even though it would mean so much more money for him and his family. And, I asked him about that, and he said, well, it's because the hours are going to go way up. And they're going to expect me to do things that's going to take me away from spending time with my family and spending time with my church family, helping the local church there. And even though the pay raise that he's giving up is absolutely huge, he told me, quote, "Brian, we don't need more money. We're fine." Family of 5, he's the only one making income for the whole family. And he says we're fine. He's not a millionaire, but he's content. 1 Timothy 6, verses 7 through 9, Paul says, "We've brought nothing into this world, so we cannot take anything out of it either. If we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. But those who want to get rich, well, they fall into temptation and a snare and many foolish and harmful desires, which plunge men into ruin and destruction." One of the snares that those who desire to get rich fall into is that they overwork themselves. And even when they take breaks, they can't really rest. They can't really get any sort of deep soul rest because all they're thinking about is all the money that they're losing by taking a break. Soul rest says, I'm not losing anything. I'm fine. God will take care of me. Number 6, soul rest cultivates humility. Let's go back to Genesis 2. Genesis chapter 2, this is where it all starts in terms of God setting the pattern for the Sabbath day. Now, he doesn't actually, you never see anybody in the book of Genesis keeping the Sabbath day. That's because he doesn't introduce the Sabbath day to human beings until Exodus 16 to the Israelites. But Genesis 2 does actually set the stage for the model of the Sabbath day upon which the later instructions of the Israelites are based. And so in Genesis 2, verses 2 through 3, it says, "By the seventh day, God completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made." Now remember, the rationale in the Exodus version of the Ten Commandments is that Israel needed to rest because God rested here on the seventh day. And that tells us two things. Number one, God designed us as human beings to need rest. I mean, you even think about Jesus. He's God in the flesh. And yet how many times is Jesus seen going off by himself, away from the crowds, going up on a mountain to pray, sleeping on a boat? And don't forget, he was a Jew and he was sinless, which means he kept every single Sabbath day. Jesus was busier than all of us. And he had a much shorter time to accomplish his work than all of us. He only had 3 years, right? He had to talk about cramming in as much as you can, right? In such a short amount of time. And yet even Jesus recognized, I need to slow down and observe the Sabbath day and rest. And yet, ironically, sometimes we overwork because in our pride, we think we're stronger than Jesus. We're Superman. We don't need rest. We'll just rest when we're dead. And many times that comes sooner than was expected because we didn't have the humility to recognize our limitations. Soul rest says, I'm human. I can't do everything all the time, and I need this rest. And I'll tell you, the second thing that this passage teaches us here in Genesis 2 is that Sabbath rest is about remembering who created the world and who sustains it. It's God. Paul says this about Jesus in Colossians 1:17. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Sometimes we overwork ourselves because we think in us all things hold together. We think that if we rest, well then everything's just going to fall apart, and we're absolutely indispensable, and we need to be in control of everything all the time, and if we rest for too long, then the universe, or at the very least, our household is just going to crumble. Soul rest says, God is in control, not me. Things will be fine if I take a break for a day. And finally, soul rest cultivates courage. The annual Day of Atonement was the time when the high priest would enter into the most holy place once a year to offer a sacrifice for the sins of the entire congregation of Israel. And interestingly, that day, well, it took place on the 7th month and on the 10th day of the 7th month, which did not always fall on a Sabbath day or a Saturday. Yet, God tells them, I want you to treat it as a Sabbath day. And he says in Leviticus 16:31, it is a Sabbath of solemn rest for you, that you may humble your souls. It is a permanent statute. So he wants them to treat it like a Sabbath day where they don't do any work at all and they devote themselves to rest, but rather, this one's a little unique because rather than being a joyful and delightful rest like normal Sabbath days, this one is more somber because this is the day where they need to face the reality of their own sinfulness. Yes, they're being forgiven, right? It's the Day of Atonement, so that's great and it's worth celebrating. But at the same time, they're confronted with the truth, okay, that I need God's forgiveness because of my sin. Sometimes the reason we overwork is because we're avoiding things that we're afraid to face. Sometimes we cannot sit still. We have to be cleaning something, texting something, scrolling something, watching something, doing something, anything, because if we sit too long, well, then we're going to have to confront our feelings. We'll have to confront our failures and sins. We have to confront a struggling relationship with our spouse or our kids. We have to face the fact that maybe when we sit down in silence with God, we realize there's not really much of a relationship there. We don't have much to say to Him. Which all means that stillness and solitude and rest become too somber and scary for us. Jane Austen once observed that the busy have no time for tears. Soul rest helps us foster the courage to confront our inner demons, so to speak. to confront the incessant negative thoughts and to take every thought captive to Christ, to humbly confess our sins and to find refreshment and joy and peace in His forgiveness, to apologize to others and to mend fences, to face truths about our life that we've known for a while, but we've just kind of been ignoring because we know it's going to require change, and change is scary. Soul rest says, I'm right here, God. I am present with you. I'm ready. I'm ready to face whatever truth you have for me. There has been a huge movement over the last couple of years of Christians trying to adopt Sabbath rest as a part of their lives. It's very fascinating. You can read a lot more about it online. Seventh-day Adventists, okay? I've had many Bible studies with them, many disagreements with them because they would like to bind the Sabbath on other people and say that we're actually required by God to do it. I think they're going too far with that. But it's interesting that there are some studies that show that Seventh-day Adventists, on average, live 11 years longer than everyone else. Now, if you do the math on that, that is 1/7 of a lifetime longer. And if they're resting for 1/7 of a week, maybe there's some wisdom to that. I just thought that was kind of interesting, okay? But of course, they go too far in binding that on people. But anyway, Christians are they've been intrigued by this idea, not just from Seventh-day Adventists, but just kind of recovering the wisdom of the Sabbath and what God maybe had in mind for us and what help that could be in our lives. But it is amazing how many people report at the same time, when I tried to do this, when I tried to implement a 24-hour period of Sabbath rest, it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I fought against it. I went kicking and screaming, right, into rest. Well, why is that? Well, one writer, he put it this way. He says, rest is an act of resistance. That's why. It's an act of resistance to our natural instincts, to societal pressure, to cultural and familial expectations, to our own habits and routines. So it's only natural that our minds and bodies will resist this act of resistance. But let me put this up. Purposeful, deliberate soul rest will break us down first before it builds us back up again. It is not something that is easy to do. But as it builds us up, we will cultivate these attributes of trust, freedom, delight, identity, contentment, humility, and courage. But of course the question is, how do we do this? What does this look like in practice? Well, there are no hard and fast rules on this, again, because these aren't, binding commands of God. But here are some suggestions. Number one, block off a 24-hour period of rest. The Jews, when they observed Sabbath, they rested from Friday at 6 p.m. to Saturday at 6 p.m. If that period doesn't work well for you and you want to pick a different 24-hour period, that's totally fine. But this might mean, in order to block that period off, it might mean, hey, I'm giving up that extra shift at work. I'm giving up the extra commission that I could make from the sales on that day. It might mean I'm saying no. I'm setting boundaries to people who are making demands on my time. And I'm telling them, look, I'm unavailable, right? I know you want to text me. That's fine. But I'm unavailable for that 24-hour period. It might mean using other days of the week, too, to try to get stuff done, get some chores done or whatever, to try to set up and protect that 24-hour time. Number two here, if 24 hours seems way too daunting right now, start smaller. Maybe start with 4 hours, just 4, right? And then as you kind of get the hang of it, then you can increase it over time. Number three, try not to do any work. Try not to check work emails or respond to work texts. If there are dishes in the sink and clothes on the floor, just leave them there. Don't mow the lawn. Don't put a bookshelf together. Don't go out and change the oil in your car. Again, I'm not binding any of this on you from the Lord, right? I'm not saying God's going to be angry at you if you do any of that. I'm just trying to paint a picture of what it's like and how hard it actually is to truly try to not do any work for a 24-hour period of time. Now, obviously, if you're a parent and you've got little kids, right, you are going to have to do some work, right, to tend to them or whatever. Jesus did heal people on the Sabbath. Jesus did help people on the Sabbath day. Okay? But if it seems hard not to work at all, keep in mind that God also told the Israelites to keep a Sabbath year. Every seventh year, to do nothing and to just let weeds and whatever comes up in your garden just grow, and you can't do anything about it. Talk about difficult. Number 4, try to break free from things that are hard to do without. Okay, for instance, maybe we turn our phone or TV off for the 24-hour period. Now, I know that sounds insane, but that only makes my point. If it sounds insane to do without electronic devices, it might be more of a hold on us. It might have more of a hold on us than we thought. It might have become a little Pharaoh in our hearts, as one writer put it. Some people, this is a little extreme, though it kind of sounds kind of fun. Some people have decided we're going to do without electricity, and we're just going to do everything by candlelight on the Sabbath day. Thought that was kind of interesting. I heard one guy talking about how he always has to know everything in the moment. And so, if he sees a bird or something, he's got to get his phone out. He's got to Google it. What kind of bird is that? If somebody mentions an actor's name, right? He's like, I got to look at my phone, see all the movies and the filmography and all that stuff. And he just decided, he told his wife, he said, look, how about for just one day, we be okay with not knowing? For one day, I'm just going to be okay with not knowing the answer in the moment. Or maybe it's, we are just driving all the time. We're in our car all the time, driving across town, hauling the kids here to their sports things and their recitals, and we're going back and forth to work. Maybe just for one day, we're not driving anywhere. We are just staying home. And maybe if things are close by, we're going to walk there instead of taking the car. Some people are slaves to buying stuff, just consumerism. And every time they sit down to rest, like the first thing they want to do, they want to open their phone, they want to scroll Amazon, they want to start buying stuff and get the 2-day shipping and all that. So maybe just for one day, we're committing to not doing that because we're not slaves to anything in this life. We don't have to do what our culture tells us we have to do or pressures us into doing. God set us free. Number 5, do something to enjoy God's creation. Go outside and take a walk. Take your kids to a local playground, and instead of scrolling through your phone, just watch them play. Listen to the laughter of the kids. Drive to the beach. Watch the ocean waves. Go to an art expo, an orchestra concert. Go to the zoo. Though sometimes trips to the zoo with kiddos might be a little too expensive and exhausting for a day of rest, so be careful with all that. If the weather is not great, it is not a binding requirement from God not to watch TV. So you could watch a show like Planet Earth, or you could go on YouTube and look up, the most beautiful places in the world, right? To create a sense of wonder and awe and worship over God's creation. Number 6, take some time as a family to read God's Word, to pray and or sing together. The Sabbath was a very communal activity. It wasn't really meant to be just kind of be done by yourself. They said God said your whole household needs to rest. Not just you and your family, but any servants that you have, even your animals. You can't be, loading things up on your donkey and making your animal work on the Sabbath either. Everybody's resting together. And it was called a Sabbath to the Lord. So the point wasn't just for everybody to do their own thing and just kind of chase after their own pleasures. It was to devote the day to God. And one of the ways the Jews did that was by worshiping together at the synagogue. And with their families in their homes, blessing the Lord, praying together. This day isn't just about physical and mental rest. Anybody can do that, okay? But it's about the soul rest. And part of that comes with making a portion of that day, and maybe even most of that day, about spiritual things. Number 7, share a meal with fellow Christians. The Sabbath, again, was meant to foster a sense of community with other people who had also been set free from God, by God from slavery. It would be really neat if you could get a bunch of Christians to kind of agree to the same 24-hour period, right? And then you could kind of rotate and have meals at each other's homes. And maybe for those meals, because cooking is a lot of work for a lot of people, you could kind of prepare them ahead of time so they're just ready to put in the oven. You could maybe order something delivered. You could eat on paper plates so you don't have to do dishes. At these meals, it might be a good time also to go around and ask each other what God is doing in your life and in your heart, making it about the Lord. Number 8, have some fun together. while Sabbath rest was not just about having fun all day long, fun is absolutely a part of the enjoyment of God's good creation, of God's good world. So why not play a game with the family or enjoy a fun hobby? Why not do what the Jews did, which was to use part of the Sabbath to enjoy their sexual relationship with their spouse? That's another way, by the way, to enjoy God's creation. Number 9, do what is restful for you. Now, what's restful for you, it might not be what's restful for me. Matt and I talk about this all the time because somehow going off-road biking is restful for Matt, and I don't get that because to me it is so stressful. I'm always worried about hitting a tree, or I'm worried about, what is that branch going to do to my bike if I hit it at the wrong angle? And I'm pretty sure I just heard a bear behind me. So it's the last thing I want to do is go off-road biking as something restful, but that's restful for Matt. So for you, that may mean taking a break from family time during that day and go read a fiction novel off by yourself for a while, or go off-road biking, or just take a nap. If it works for you, then great. And finally, take miniature soul rests throughout the week. You can view it as kind of practice for the big day, but remember, in Jesus, we can have rest, soul rest, anytime, any day, because our true rest is in Him. That means I might take 15 minutes of a lunch break to pray and thank God for saving me. I might listen to a podcast on the way to work that helps create wonder at God's Word and God's work. Or I might pick up the phone in the evening and connect with a fellow Christian and strengthen that relationship in Christ. I understand. Again, the Sabbath is no longer binding on us as a requirement from God, but I believe there's a lot of wisdom in the principles behind the Sabbath that can help us. It can actually be a gift to us on a weekly basis and ultimately help us, if you're not a Christian, to lead you to Christ, but even more so, if you are a Christian, to enjoy your relationship with Christ even more. He is the true rest that the Sabbath was pointing toward all along, because only He can give us the hope of that eternal Sabbath rest with God. It was Augustine, I'll finish with this. It was Augustine who said this: you have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. Is your heart restless this morning? Have you found rest in Jesus? You can this morning. Jesus says, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." And then you can live your whole life in hope and anticipation for the ultimate Sabbath rest in heaven. If you want that rest, you can have it this morning by believing in Jesus, being willing to be baptized this morning for the forgiveness of your sins. And if you've done that already, and you're already a Christian, but you're restless because you're just overworked and exhausted, and you're using your work to fill a void in your soul that only Jesus can fill, Jesus says, stop doing that. Let me fill that void. Come home to my rest. If we can help you in any way to find that soul rest in 2024, come forward and let us know how. We stand.